I don't think I need to read them out. I'd just like to say that I did actually post as the first message in the chat function today a link to the centre's website, so that you can go to the website and find out what we're doing this term. We've got 4 events beyond this one here, and they cover a range of very different subjects. We've got one on racial politics and modernism, one on the making of the new Soviet man, a new kind of reading of that, one on Gothic revival and sexuality, and one on urbanism. So it's a very mixed bag this term. I should say that most of those actually link up with talks that we've had in the previous years. We have kind of series of talks, but they don't necessarily occur in the same year. So we are kind of extending some of the themes that we've been developing in previous talks in previous years. I'd like to just, I think I'm just checking. I see everyone has actually muted themselves. I think that's great. Thank you for that. In the discussion following Ray's talk, if you want to speak, use the hands up function and we'll come to you. And then if you could turn on both your mic and your camera, it would be good to see you. It's a small group we've got right now. I suspect it won't get much bigger during the talk, but it would be great to see you when you come in with a question or a comment. Okay, I'm now going to pass over to Leslie McFadyen, who's going to say a few words about tonight's speaker. Leslie.
Thank you. Dr. Ray Lucas is Reader in Architecture at the Manchester School of Architecture, and there he leads on the humanities, committed to a cross-disciplinary approach in architecture and drawing out the interconnectedness of the built environment. Of course, it's no surprise that he teaches thinking through drawing, a discussion of architectural drawing itself and using drawing to explore history. And this is how I know Ray best. I first met Ray whilst he was researching his PhD in social anthropology at the University of Aberdeen. Towards a theory of notation as a thinking tool, brought to my attention other ways of drawing movement in time and space, and all through Tokyo Station. We were both part of Professor Tim Ingold's project, Anthropology, Archaeology, Art and Architecture. And then I went on to read and be inspired by his books, Drawing Parallels, and now Anthropology for Architects, which tonight we have for a 35% discount. From Ray, I have learned how the temporary and mobile make the city through drawings that count. I've learned to make this matter in my prehistory and archaeological architecture. The scale of his work, the focus on architecture as design practice and drawing context. I hope there's lots here for you to learn too from tonight with graphic anthropology. Over to you, Ray.
All right, thank you very much. Nice to see a copy of the book in the wild there. Tonight's talk draws a little bit on that book. There's a chapter that touches on these issues, but this is work in progress. It's working towards the next monograph, essentially, on the architecture of the Matsuri of these Japanese festivals. And tonight's talk will focus on Sanja Matsuri in particular, but then discuss some of the other festivals at the very end of it. And the approach is really to start to talk about what a graphic anthropology might mean, what constitutes a graphic anthropology, and how this might differ from anthropologies of architecture, architectural anthropology as an overarching grouping, and the recent moves towards ethnographic architecture by the likes of Momoyo Kaijima of Atelier Bao Bao. So just a few words just to start on what Sanja Matsuri is. It's an annual festival held in the Asakusa ward of Tokyo. And Asakusa is essentially the oldest district of the city. It's the site of the fishing village which grew into Edo, later established as Tokyo by the Tokugawa shogunate. And Asakusa is the key shitamachi, or working class downtown district of the city. Sits outside of the high town, the Yamanote, and it's got a character unlike the rest of the city. It was once the entertainment district of the city, and artists such as Utsumaro and Hokusai, and others, and authors such as Ishiguro and Kawabata, have written and drawn about the nature of it as an entertainment district. It maintains its identity in part due to this annual Shinto festival, which celebrates the founding of the Asakusa Jinja around 628 Common Era, when fishermen found a bronze statue of the Kanon Bosatsu, the deity of mercy, in the Sumida River. They threw this back 3 times before they threw it back into the river, and it kept returning to them. So after the 3rd time, they decided to keep it and build a shrine around it. The site that we're talking about is shared between the much smaller Shinto shrine and the large Buddhist temple of Sensoji, which has, much more prominence in the site. But over the course of these 3 days in May, the shrine is the focus of attention. Sensoji itself is commonly held to be Tokyo's oldest temple, and it's been rebuilt a number of times due to fires and earthquakes and firebombing and so on. But the festival is held over 3 days in May, and it takes over the Asakusa ward completely, one of 23 wards in the city of Tokyo. It's a series of processions and celebrations. Central to it is the complex of Sensoji and Asakusa Jinja, and the sacred precinct, which contains both of these site, a common state of affairs in Japanese sacred architecture, where the coexistence of multiple belief systems is held by individuals as well as the population at large. The days preceding the festival proper, there are street food stalls set up in the area, and we'll start to see a little bit more of what happens within this. But there are a number of key aspects of this which make it to be of intensely architectural interest. And I'd like to sort of draw attention to these before I get into describing how I've gone about this. There are a number of temporary occupations of space that happen during these 3 days. So the common reading of the festival is that it's a state of misrule that takes over the place, that the normal order of things is often reversed. And this is certainly partly the case in Sanja Matsuri. One of the other aspects of the festival, though, is that it heightens the ordinary. And this is one of the things that is highlighted by Henri Lefebvre when writing his notes written one Sunday in the French countryside, that festival differs from everyday life only in the explosion of forces which had slowly been accumulated in and via everyday life itself. And he goes on to, note that there's a state of violence, but that it's not separate from everyday life, that it is an aspect of, this continual building up. And my argument in this talk is that Sanja Matsuri makes Asakusa. It reaffirms the neighbourhood and the community bonds within that. And that's not a romantic notion. It isn't overwhelmingly positive. Sedimented power relations are strengthened by this, as much as the opportunity for residents to really celebrate what it means to be in the city. And it feels it's somewhat ironic to be talking about a mass gathering under our current circumstances, and it might have been more appropriate for example, to talk about Gion Festival a little bit more. Gion is a festival which was initiated after a plague, a pandemic hit the city of Kyoto, and which is held every year in order to appease the plague gods. So there's a relationship with pandemic and disease in these festivals. And this year's festival was postponed in May and still held last week. I'd planned to be in Tokyo at this point in time, but they're still not allowing foreigners into the country, so I had to cancel that trip. So a much reduced version of the festival was held last week, which misses some of the more engaging aspects of it, but which is still present in evidence that's been posted on the Shrine's own website. So there's an intersection with where we're at in the world right now. Victor Turner is obviously, you know, one of these sort of controversial figures in architecture and in anthropology, and this notion of the liminal, of threshold states is something which architects took on from anthropology quite early in the crossover between the two disciplines, sometimes willfully misreading that or reading it through the ways in which language is used in architecture. But the notion of the liminal state introduced within the festival, and the idea, you know, the conventional idea that he gives us here, that for a while almost anything goes, taboos are lifted, fantasies enacted, behavior is reversed, the lower exalted and the mighty abased. So there's this idea that, you know, that the festival allows certain things to happen. But when it comes to understanding this really intensely complex explosional activity in the city, certain other approaches have to be taken. And this is where I begin to revive the work that I was doing very early on in my research career with Tim Ingold. And the festival, over the course of the 3 days, attracts around 100 local neighbourhood associations. And each of these has a portable shrine called a mikoshi. And these congregate in the sacred precinct of Asakusa shrine in order to be blessed and make their way home again. And this is not an orderly procession. The streets are closed and this is boisterous and full of activity. It's noisy, it's energetic, it's exhausting. And this means that everywhere you look on the middle day of the festival, there's something else going on. It's very easy to be distracted, and the normal tools of representation begin to break down. So it revived my interest in notation. It brought me back to the notion of looking at things like movement notation in addition to architectural representations. So it brings me back to the work of Nelson Goodman, who in Languages of Art starts to divide up the inscriptive practices, the ways in which we make marks onto surfaces in order to communicate our perceptions and in order to channel how we observe the world around us. So it gives us these distinctions between the autographic and the allographic mark, the autographic being the mark that relies on the gesture of the individual, you know, the Picasso or Paul Klee gestural painting, whereas the allographic mark is like a notation, like a musical notation, where the important thing is that the symbol conforms to what we expect it ought to look like, and that it comes with some sort of instructional or linguistic content. And he goes on to divide up the idea of the script and the score, and talking about the relationship between scripts and scores and performances. And one of the ways that I wanted to talk about this is to try and see where the city itself becomes a script, where the city itself starts to tell people how to behave, related to ideas of agency that we see elsewhere in architectural and anthropological literature. So the script is the set of performances determined by scripts. These are broad stage directions and performances measured against a script to gauge the compliance. And the score is this set of instructions, the explicit dialogue within a play, the score in classical music. So it's about the relative conformity to or compliance with a set of instructions. And he talks about, you know, the relationship between architectural drawings and the eventual architecture that comes from them. But my interests fell with movement notations and looking at the history of dance notation in particular, and the different ways in which the complexity of moving human bodies has been encoded over the years. So going back to 1496 with the Cervera manuscripts, we have this complexity over the letter notation, where you need to know what each of these moves is in order to make any sense of that notation. So it opens up the idea of the relative amount of expertise that you need in order to be able to read a notation. So it makes this expertise in reading as central to then understanding some of the things that we're looking at. So other forms of notation very quickly would then rely on plans, and it becomes something which is published. You know, books of choreographies are then put into circulation. These become aestheticized because they're on the page. You can start to make patterns that those dancing would never actually see. And we start to see the solution of some of the problems, introducing sequentiality in these kind of track notations, or relationships back to other forms of notations, and borrowing the logic from musical notations. And by the time we get to the 20th century, there's an explosion of different types of pictorial notation and also linguistic-based notations that use matrices and large amounts of redundancy in order to communicate the complexity of these movements. Now, the figure who is hard to avoid in this discussion is Rudolf von Laban, and particularly pleased to have found this photograph of him explaining the system itself. It's perhaps ironic that he's sitting down, and earlier photos of him are somewhat more dynamic. And he's an interesting figure, very much embedded in the traditions of modernism, working with the Dadaists and escaping Germany before the war breaks out, coming to the UK and working on time and motion studies within factory production here. So he's got this interesting shift where he starts to move notation away from specific dance traditions and towards a generalized system of movement notation. Now, it's very complex to learn. It's a collection of symbols with a kind of organization where it's read from the bottom of the page up. Each of these staffs would be for a different group of dancers, and it moves from the support movements out towards postures and then towards gestures. So the most important to remaining upright out to the most communicative flourishes. So there's a general logic in the organization. And it takes a long time to learn this, and there's a density within some of the symbols which is incredibly rich. And in the past, I've made use of this to notate things like the scenes from Kurosawa films and the orchestration of various movements within a sumo bout. The interesting thing about Laban notation is that it places the reader in the place of the performer. It is not seen in the same way as a pictorial notation, as though on a stage or against a mirror, but from the point of view of the internalized embodied forces that you have to enact in order to make particular moves. So more than just being a really complete system, it has an absolutely essential way of understanding the human body, and that center and position and the coordinates of the body all measured against this heavy set of symbolism. Very briefly, another key reference for this is Kon Wajiro and the notion of modernology. He was an architect who sort of wandered into a kind of social concern in the aftermath of the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923. And he wanted to document the shift that Tokyo was undergoing at that point from its feudal past, not its recent past, into adopting modern imported ways of living, clothing, and so on. So we're seeing these depictions of costumes, of buildings, of postures, and this meticulous detail about the everyday, about the boring, about the mundane, about the quotidian. And again, that resonates very closely with the things that I'm interested in describing. So he goes, he describes things like the differing hairstyles and the persistence of these farmhouse buildings and various other aspects of life as he sees it around him. So he forms quite an interesting sort of touching point with a tradition in Japanese architecture to describe the world around them. And it takes me back to my friend and mentor, Tim Ingold. To correspond with the world through drawing, therefore, is to practice not ethnography, but graphic anthropology, or to coin a term, anthropography. Tim's great, but I don't think he's very good at coining words necessarily. So I'm going to stick with graphic anthropology rather than anthropography. I think there's a resonance with why this is different from ethnography and why ethnography remains valuable and does several different things. But I would like to pursue a graphic anthropology of Sanja Matsuri. So this comes in two parts. The first is the familiar idea of what one does when visiting a field site. And arguably, I have a field site that exists for 3 days every year. So that makes for quite an interesting sort of condensation of the activity. So it becomes very difficult to draw in situ. Many people would assume that the best possible thing to do would be to be on the street sketching as these events unfold. And that would have some value, but it would miss a great deal of other things. So I go about recording in the in situ situation and developed a position towards post situ, almost post rationalization, which is very familiar to most architects. The first thing that I would like to talk about is filming and simply being on the street and starting to see the events as they unfold. So while it might have been preferable to describe all of the things that are happening, I will describe little bits, little fragments of what's going on with each piece of data that I show. So one of the things that happens is that the mikoshi, which is here, is a portable shrine, or sometimes referred to as a divine palanquin. And each of the 100 or so local neighbourhoods has a kami, a minor deity who is installed into this palanquin and carried around the streets for the duration of the festival. This is stored. This is the rest of the year. It's placed into storage, and then it's assembled carefully by carpenters on the street. They also assemble temporary structures around things like the neighbourhood association headquarters, decorating the street with lanterns and with foliage. Bamboo structures are strapped to the front of buildings, paper streamers, and we'll see later descriptions of what happens inside the neighbourhood association as well. But this is built on the street. So everyday life is going on around this. This is just a couple of days before the main event, and there are various other constructions going on around us. But I position this as a filmic architecture of Matsuri, taking me back to even earlier research that I did into the relationship between film and architecture, how they share certain logics. And it takes me back to the reason why I went to Japan and Tokyo in the first place, was essentially inspired by Chris Marker's astonishing documentary or filmed poem, Sans Soleil, from 1983. It also resonates with theories around the urban wanderer, the flaneur. Charles Baudelaire, who inspires Walter Benjamin later, writing in the poem Crowds as the first poet to really celebrate the city as opposed to the natural world. And he's arguing that it's not given to every man to take a bath of multitude. Enjoying a crowd is an art, and only he can relish a debauch of vitality at the expense of the human species, on whom, in his cradle, a fairy has bestowed the love of masks and masquerading, the hate of home and the passion for roaming. But I've been drawn to more contemporary filmmakers such as Claire Denis and the physicality of a film such as Beau Travail, and the orchestration, the embodiment that is present within these films, that you start to read back what you're watching on the film. And it starts to engage with embodiment theory across both, a number of disciplines, but also between film and architecture. And also to think of these films as being recorded for a particular reason. So this material is used to derive the notations that you'll see later. The photographs are used to build up the material for the drawings, and the soundscapes almost stand on their own as atmospheric explorations of what it feels like to be in these spaces. On the first day of the festival, there's a parade that weaves through the street a number of performers, each representing an aspect of the city. So it's about representing Asakusa, Edo, and Tokyo. And it's rooted in the fishing village origins of the city. So these dancers are dressed as herons, as the birds that fishermen used to train to fish with them. And they perform a particular dance as they weave their way around the city, reinscribing the city, making alternative understandings of that space through their activities there. Other filmmaking traditions remain important as well, and directors such as the great Agnes Varda, who place themselves within the film, much like any ethnographer has to acknowledge what their presence does within a particular site. There's not much time to go into that explicitly. But before we get into the rest of it, it's worth seeing what a mikoshi looks like in motion. The groups of mikoshi bearers have to work in concert with one another and have to be very precisely in time. So it involves a certain soundscape, it involves the bouncing up and down in very particular movements which are well trained amongst the groups of carriers. And again, we'll see examinations of this as we go through later on. Another aspect of the in situ examination is the soundscape. This would take a while to get through, but essentially to start editing the world around us, when there are 100 mikoshi on one day, each with a carrying pack of around 80 people, weighing the same as a small car. These heavy timber lacquered structures which are being bounced up and down, side to side, in order to ring the bells on them with the chants timing as they go along. There's too many things to gather all that data at once. So I've been going back year after year, 6 or so years now, picking out different things as I go and editing, carefully selecting and taking things out of the equation and putting them back in. So the idea is that all of this data layers up, all of this information becomes a mass of collection that you can start to dive into and just examine the sound, or you can look at the movements and use that to derive notations, or the photographs to build up drawings. And some of these can be edited into specific pieces for different reasons. So this was used at a conference as part of a presentation. Again, we're short of time today, so apologies for talking over this too much. Obviously, photography then forms a part of this. I've mentioned it a few times, and there are differences between the photographs and filming practices that one makes in order to make a film or to have the photograph stand on its own, or the ones which are used in order to make drawings. So in a way, these photographs are taken with the logic of a drawing, with the idea of an axonometric, an elevation, a cross section, a plan. These photographs are taken with that logic in mind. And it might not always be immediately apparent, but each of these is used as evidence later on, as the way of understanding various components of the festival as it unfurls. So these are some of the carpenters building temporary structures, taking over car parking areas, decorating them so that we don't see the corrugated metal roof, but they're covered with these reeds. And a lot of modern materials are dressed up to look traditional. You know, there's this aesthetic of as soon as you put a piece of bamboo or reed matting on something, then it somehow enters into circulation as a part of the festival. Examining the work of the carpenters who are assembling the mikoshi. This is before the spirit has been installed into it, so it can rest on the ground. As soon as it has the spirit inside it, it becomes sacred and must be set on trestles. There's a great deal of skill displayed in the assembly of these well-worn pieces of timber, which are, you know, brought out of storage every year. And you can see the wear and tear on the lacquer on the edge here. And you start to see the various constituencies at work, the attendants of the main shrine itself, who have the symbol of the Sanja, of the Asakusa shrine, the 3 fishing nets, on the symbol on the back of their jackets here. And we'll see much more of this as we go through. The costume and posture becomes very important in how people occupy the city, how they make their presence felt. So temporary structures are erected for a variety of purposes. These are name boards where those who have paid in to the upkeep of this neighbourhood's mikoshi and parade, their names are displayed so you can see which of your neighbours have given into the joint enterprise of the festival. And each neighbourhood has its own design of happy coat. So each of these is different and tells you which neighbourhood people belong to. A number of occupations of space happen spontaneously. So structures go up in the middle of the road as garages, as storage spaces for the large drums and smaller children's mikoshi. And it's about this occupation of the street, the city, making itself the most city-like it can be. And the various elements of the district making themselves visible. So it's about the city making itself manifest in front of its neighbours and saying, this is who we are. So again, the procession of the heron dancers, and temporary stages are erected all over the ward for musicians, and these are joined by mobile pieces of architecture as well, mobile stages which mount bands with drums and flutes and so on, which really builds that soundscape as you move around the city. But it's energetic, it's boisterous, it's full of life. And it, you know, this floods the whole street with activity, so it's impossible for traffic to make its way around. It's been described to me somewhat akin to an extreme sport being involved in the carrying of the mikoshi. But there's also the neighbourhood associations with the offerings of rice cakes and sake, bringing out the festive food, which is then consumed by the neighbours later on, and all the ritual items which are put on display. You know, there's a museum aspect to this, which is heightened in other festivals. But at the end of the day's festivities. The street is taken over, temporary parties take place, making use of the street, making use of car parking spaces, of garages. Any spare land can have a table put down on it, and people gather together to celebrate. So the post-situ situation is about drawing and about understanding through drawing, about seeing drawing as a way of understanding your own perception, of remaining in the moment and extending the moment for longer, dwelling within the evidence from the in situ data. So the first of these is to consider drawing and to engage with the notion of the material culture that surrounds the festival. So this notion of Matsuri material culture leads me to start producing a large series of drawings. These are around A5 in size, using axonometric projection, but with a different scale each time, not really worrying about that aspect of it. By drawing these everyday ordinary things alongside ritual items and using architectural representation techniques, you allow these to enter into circulation as pieces of architecture, even if it's as simple as a child's paddling pool, which has been repurposed as an icebox for cold drinks, or a small set of steps. But each of these things starts to tell us something about the commercial nature of the festival. It's unabashedly commercial. The ad hoc use of board and plastic crates, the name boards that are in signage, which is assembled in various different ways, the ritual items of the paper streamers, and all of these things that tell us parts of the story. So accumulating 60 or 80 of these so far, that you start to build this picture of what the festival is doing on a small scale to parts of the city. Each of these is a narrative. So, these small temporary structures, the use of scaffolding poles and tarpaulin, but dressed up with cord and with leaves and lanterns. And these structures start to tell us about how the city is occupied, breaking it down into fragments before starting to think about building it back up again. So it's about seriality of drawing. It's not a singular activity. You build up drawing after drawing after drawing in order to really immerse yourself within the context, and that nothing is too ordinary to escape attention. And I think that's the important thing, is to look at these foil plates and the ashtray and the used drinks cups here alongside the performative, alongside these elements which are used in informal dance. So turning the attention more to the mikoshi itself, and that there are massive variations within these. There are the 100 or so local ones, and then the 3 main mikoshi that belong to the shrine itself. And these are complex. These are decorated slightly differently from one another. These are bear many of the hallmarks of a Shinto shrine, but almost an ideal form. So that the roof form has the curvature, but in an exaggerated way. There are these torii gates which lead up, which lead you to a set of stairs. There's a threshold to this. There's an interior. This is a miniature building. And there's literature that argues that the original form of the Shinto shrine is designed to be uprooted, is designed as a lightweight structure that can be carried. So these have a number of differences, number of different approaches, and there's a catalogue of these different mikoshi and what they look like. But more importantly, there's the idea of how it's carried. So looking at this, by this point, a lot of anthropologists are wondering where all the people are. But they do come into this. They do come into these drawings. But you can see the distortions that happen to the human body when you depict it in axonometric give us a very particular way of representing the human body. But this is useful at showing you the main carrying pack, the different grips that are necessary in different parts of this pack, the people on the perimeters who are either guiding or pushing in order to maintain the coherence of the group carrying the mikoshi itself. the group who are following are ready at a moment's notice to replace anybody who becomes exhausted and has to duck out here. So somebody who's waiting always to jump in to the carrying of the mikoshi. You've got a group at the front who have fans and timber clappers to direct where the mikoshi is going, and various dignitaries at the front who give speeches and talk about the nature of the festival when it comes to its resting points. So you start to look at the whole group who are carrying this as part of the architecture. I'm sure this is something that Leslie will be able to say more about. This notion of the implication of human bodies into architecture is really important. But it's all based on community. It all comes back to an idea of community and the way in which these neighbourhood associations become decorated and brought into use during the festival. So structures are bolted onto the outside to allow drummers to sit on the upper floor. Decorations of red and white celebratory fabric on the inside. The curtains with the symbols of the festival. The frames which would carry lanterns. The seating. The tables where you would come and pay so that your name is up on the name board, and then the kegs of beer and food that is all there for the celebration afterwards. So each of these things, it builds and builds and builds. But at one point, discussing that lack of people, the costume and the posture of people is incredibly important here. So another series of drawings is these small watercolors, looking at not only what people are wearing and the idea that people are going promenading in the city to be seen as well as to see what's going on. So those who aren't explicitly part of the festival will still dress up. And again, these representatives of parts of the city that aren't normally visible, be that the Shinto priests or the small number of geisha, and people just wearing their best kimonos, as well as those who are explicitly part of the event itself, who are wearing the coat of their neighborhood. And people adopt a different persona, a different stance, depending on their presence within the city. They're making their presence felt. And that's where the city becomes at its most city-like. It becomes something which is really powerful as an expression of what it means to be a part of Asakusa, a part of Tokyo. And within this, there are some extraordinary moments, such as the almost shamanistic character of the Tengu, who's almost independent of the main event of the festival, but who weaves a path through the various things that are going on. So there are all these collapsing of the sacred, the profane, the legitimate and the illegitimate within the festival. And I've chosen not to represent one of the more famous aspects of this festival, of the presence of the Yakuza, of the organised crime gangs, who also make their presence felt and are quite a controversial element of the festival, where for these 3 days they show off the tattoos that they would normally hide. They make themselves very visible, and it's a show of force. But there's still, a large part of the festival which is really about the everydayness of life within Asakusa. Other elements start to come in, such as these temporary installations of yatai, of food stalls, this gustatory architecture which occupies the sacred precinct with a number of amazing scents, the pungency of the oil that's cooking, the smoke that pumps out from all the steaming that's going on, all of the flavors that are available to you in this space. And this brings me to earlier projects on sensory notations. Again, not enough time to get into this, but ways of recording and making sketchbooks of sensory perceptions that one has within these spaces. But there's a relationship with the legitimate aspects of the city. Again, misusing the romantic notion of the watercolour to draw police vans, and exploring how these define space, how these are differently present within the city from usual. So there is a presence, nominally for safety and protection of people, and to make sure that traffic does stop when people take over the streets and so on. But during these 3 days, they are in the service of the people. They are taking orders from the everyday residents of Asakusa and from the Shinto Shrine Association itself. So they're explicitly in the service of the city at this point. An obvious form of representation is mapping, and looking at what happens over the 3 days, the small scale of the movement of the Friday afternoon procession compared with the complexity, and this is just a fragment of what happens on Saturday with all of the shrines converging on Asakusa Shrine here. The limitation by the river that this part of the city has its own festival at a different time, as does this one up here. And then on Sunday, the 3 main mikoshi go out on different routes, and they are there's a status about who gets to carry these first, and also about having a mikoshi pass by and stop at your property. So it's about good fortune, it's about favour, and these routes are redesigned every year by the Shinto priests. But I'd like to return to the embodiment aspect of it and to think about different forms of notation. The easiest ones to understand are pictorial notations, but they don't give us a full picture of what's going on. They don't tell us everything that we might need to know. So this sequence looks through the gathering around it, the speeches before, the carrying, the lifting of the mikoshi onto the shoulders, the rocking from side to side, and then the circulation of people in and out of the carrying group. And the notion of the structure, that the people are implicated, and just this, if the weight going down is 100, how much of it is borne by this person when it's rocked to this side as opposed to that side. And once we get into the more complex notations, the Laban notations, a number of things become apparent. And this is why I'd like to focus on this, the potential of this. And this is the least resolved part of the set of drawings. But it's about starting to use the notation as an analytical tool. So working through, taking notes, and working out what the sets of symbols I'm going to need are, and constructing notations of the left and right mikoshi bearers, developing stage directions that allow you to access what's going on at each of these points. And as soon as you start analysing the video footage in order to extract this notation, you start to understand what people's feet are doing, how their knees are bending, how they're clasping onto the which support the mikoshi, and how different members of the carrying pack are working in different ways. And through this observation, you start to see just how the people pushing on the perimeters are working, how there are some anchors inside the carrying pack who pull their full weight down onto the mikoshi, so that they are actually adding weight and forcing the whole structure into compression. So you get into quite architectural language about how people are operating in this sense. So this becomes more than a description, it becomes an analytical tool. And that's the power of this kind of notation, is that it's so detailed that it focuses and forces your attention into thinking about, well, where are people looking? How are they getting cues from outside? How are they responding to this prop, this mikoshi? What direction are they moving in? All of these things come into a notation that goes down to the detail of the individual knuckles on people's fingers, if you want it to. The final part of this is really to think about some of the other festivals. This is part of a larger project which has been looking at more processional festivals, such as Aoi Festival in Kyoto, which is processional and imperial in nature, so much more to do with costume and adoption of personas, and looking at different ways of describing some of the set pieces of this. Other costume-based festivals, Sanja Matsuri, which is quite similar to Sanja, but you can see the extent of this with the number of mikoshi. I think there's about 12 in this shot, against the modernity of Akihabara, of Electric Town, with the train lines running over the top and so on. You know, the sheer quantity of people gathering at this point. The nighttime festivals such as Kuriyama, which are arranged around 2 or 3 meter high drums, which resonate through the city by lantern light. And finally to Gion Matsuri, the month-long festival in Kyoto, with slightly different postures and events and costumes. But again, using these methods to describe what goes on in Gion, where parts of the permanent infrastructure of the city are designed to accommodate this festival. There are permanent post holes in the ground that allow the construction of these 25-meter high hoko floats. There are buildings with first floor openings which allow a bridge to be built over to the upper deck of these floats. So there are permanent traces of this month-long festival in the city all the time. So again, these descriptions of postures and people and the temporary installations on the street. One of the Yama floats here, sort of zooming in to see the temporary structures, the parasols, the signboards, and how the city opens itself up as a museum during this month, where the townhouses actually open their doors and show their treasures off. And so, there's an aspect of the city revealing itself to its residents during this time. And, similar events such as the carrying of these much larger gold-coloured mikoshi. Too much to get into there, but again, I do have a short, rough cut of a film that I've made out of the footage of this, engaging the filmmaking side of things much more. So I would end on a number of propositions. I'm aware I'm probably a bit over time now, but the propositions are that I'm engaging in an anthropology, but not an ethnography. Not yet, anyway. At some point it would be great to spend time, with the people making the mikoshi, their particular manufacturers, and learning more about that, or with the carpenters who assemble these on the street and so on. But it is an anthropology and it's an architectural project. It's looking at the architectural nature of the occupation of space, of the appropriation of the temporary, of the cyclical nature of the architecture. And in a way, you can begin to pull out, much like Rem Koolhaas did for Manhattan, the idea of a retroactive manifesto based on Sanja Matsuri. What are the implicit rules for architecture that could be derived from this event that is so embedded in temporality? And it gives us this indication that this is actually quite an avant-garde architecture. It brought the work of Cedric Price to mind, the fun palaces and the generators and all of those temporary manifestations in space, those ways in which people were given agency over the city. That is what happens here, but it goes back centuries rather than to the 1960s. It also speaks to the temporalities of inscriptive practice, and that these are not seen as finished, final, beautiful things, but as working processes, as observations, as parts of a much larger set. So people rewrite the city. They conform to scores, they write their own scripts, and essentially in the end Sanja Matsuri makes Asakusa. It reaffirms Asakusa every year. It tells us what is going on every year. It gives us that re-engagement with the city because it's a social condition. It's not a purely geometric condition. And that's what this begins to open up as a general set of lessons for architects, the students that I'm teaching, and so on. So that's where I'd like to end. I'll put my contact details and the various funding bodies up at the end there, and hopefully see that there's still an audience out there and that I've not just been shouting into my laptop again.
We're here, and if anyone else wants to switch their camera on, please do. And can we take any questions?
Leslie, could I just say that we're still recording? And as we're entering the Q&A, if anyone prefers not to be recorded, just let me know. You can use the chat if you prefer to let us know that way, and we'll obviously turn off the recording.
Hi, Matthew. Seem to be saying hello to all the Matthews at the moment. So.
Mark, you've got your hand up. Yeah,
sure. Thanks very much for that, Ray. It was a really fascinating talk. I got so much from that. I'm interested, of course, in the aesthetics of your drawings here, but and I'm not sure if I want to ask a very direct question about them, because I think that what you're doing is actually reflecting on the aesthetics by using very, very different graphic means. I'm very interested in the use of the axonometric, especially in this kind of context. But I don't really want to so much ask a question about the aesthetics here as about the relationship between the aesthetics, the graphics, the description, forms of description here, and something which I tentatively call meaning, which you also are very tentative about. I mean, occasionally you made a big statement like, it's about the city making itself manifest. And, generally, though, you kept away from that kind of statement. You were describing your own descriptions most of the time, which I think is, I can see why you want to do that, because in a sense you want to kind of, I guess, I mean, tell me if this is wrong, but I'm guessing that what you want to do is you want to stay at the level of exploration, of trying to see, trying to render what you see, try not to reach conclusion, trying, in a sense, not to speak to people who will tell you what this is about, but instead to see how it makes its significances through its kind of object nature, through its movements, through relations within the city, things like that. But I must ask the question here of, how did you get from your graphics, your descriptions, to statements like it's about the city making itself manifest?
Well, I think that's it's a good observation that you're making, and that it's work in progress. So a lot of it is interim, but then there are these sweeping statements that come in, or apparently sweeping. One of the things about the festival is the way in which the different aspects of the city make themselves visible. So it's about the visibility of the various normally hidden aspects of the city. Things which you don't normally see are deliberately put on show. And that's something in common with a number of the other festivals. But, things like the performing groups are normally just, in a rehearsal hall, not visible in the city. The geisha is such a small community in this part of Tokyo now, but they make sure that they are visible here. And this reenactment of elements of history, the reenactment of the fishermen who come singing, wearing their boater hats, and the women dressed as the herons performing their particular dance along with other performers. And then there's these other elements, the Yakuza making themselves known. So it conforms to that discussion of the festive state of the city as opening the box up and seeing all of the things that make the city up. The normal residents want to come out and see it. The restaurateurs are there to make the most of it. It attracts itinerant food stall holders who move from festival to festival. So we've got all of these components that come into the city and make themselves known. So I think that's what that is really about, and opening up all of those things. But I suppose the focus on this talk was to try and talk about what a graphic anthropology might mean and how it might add on to existing ethnographies. So there are ethnographies of this kind of event that exist. Michael Ashkenazi and a number of others have written these that look largely at similar rural events, but give us a great deal of information about what ethnographic data would give us about this, and how that intersects with my understanding of this one. But coming into this as an architecture academic, you can't help but come at it thinking, what can we make of this? How can we make this understanding architectural, and how can we mobilize it in a way that opens up the potential of design? That this is temporal. It's moving away from the sort of cliches of the permanence of architecture, and looking at different types of temporality. It's not just one alternative temporality, but many. And as soon as you start expressing it as architecture, it opens up a lot of possibilities for us. So it becomes a really useful way of talking about architecture and developing towards a kind of iterative aesthetics. And that's the way that I've been working with students with this kind of material, is that, it's informing discussions with studio tutors as well as within the humanities teaching as well, and opening up what we consider to be architecture beyond, Pevsner's Lincoln Cathedral example, where he rules certain things out, says they're just mere building. And I want to start bringing more things into architecture and saying that this small structure on casters, this modest thing activating the street, is doing an incredible job, and is, to me, quite an architectural thing, particularly in conjunction with all of these temporary decorations, these temporary structures, these buildings which are mobile and activating the street in quite different ways. So it's about what we can learn about these events architecturally, and they're not unique. There are different festivals across the world that are doing similar things, so it's not unique to the Japanese context.
Ray, you've got two more questions, one from Kate and then one from Matthew Barrack. Kate?
Hey, first of all, thank you so much for this beautiful, immersive paper that I'm going to be thinking about for a while. So I'm going to ask a question coming from my own situatedness as a medieval archaeologist and historian. Already I'm thinking so much about ways to reframe the kind of focus on rogational architectures and processional architectures in the Middle Ages, but what I finally found myself thinking about was so-called nomadic architectures. And in particular, things like the Mongol tent cities of the 13th and 14th centuries, which are mobile and portable and can be ad hoc, but which territorialize the landscape in which they are erected with a cosmology that emanates out of them, but that also finds resonance in that landscape. And the question that what I wanted to hear more about was, how is the transformation of the city that was there and is there and will continue to be there, in addition to the revealing of hidden parts of the city. So you mentioned these like fantastic moments, like you mentioned the kind of granting of favor and good fortune to the locations which are like stopping points on the procession, and also the kind of the revealing of private into public space. Could you talk a little bit more about, like, I found like a little bit like in a satisfying aesthetic way evacuated out of your diagrams, like the architecture that is around the landscape that is around these temporary or mobile architectures. Like how is the city like rewritten but incorporating what has already been there?
Yeah, there's a lot of work to do on that, and it's the limitations of time and being a full-time academic, as we all appreciate.
Yeah,
there's something that's why some of the drawings are actually a series of tiny things, because you can find time for those and do lots of and grabbed pieces of time. But in terms of what happens to the space, is that there's maybe a week or two of slow build up, but after the festival it's packed away immediately. It stops very suddenly. You go around those same sites on Monday morning and everything's gone. Everything has been taken down that morning. So there, there's this slow build up and then it's gone. So it's quite interesting the way in which that state of slow build up and release of energy, and then suddenly we're back into the normal city. It reverts back to this supposed normality very, very quickly. I don't know if that sort of responds to your question as directly. Maybe the notion of the nomadic, it does make me think of Stephanie Bunn's work on felts and fabric and that kind of materiality that she's worked much more on. And I think that there's a kind of ad hoc materiality to this, which is interesting me. It's an architecture that's made out of tarpaulin and casters as much as it is out of lacquered timber. So there's this mix between the super traditional and the whatever we'll do at the time. And I think the different festivals engage with the environment in different ways. So there's a planning academic that wrote a paper, Naoko Sayo, about a small town which had built over the traditional route of their festival. And their festival took similar structures down into the river and back again. But the festival eventually died because the fabric of the city changed and it didn't accommodate that festival anymore. So I think there's a fragility to these things, as well as it's not overwhelmingly positive either. There are aspects of this which can be read quite negatively as well. So I think there's a great deal more complexity to get into, but I would like to unpack that day by day unfurling of one of these key sites. I've got lots of photographic work to build that up from. I'm just waiting for the time to actually spend with it to really get into that. So it suffers a little bit for being work in progress at the moment, but it's also it can never be completed. It's one of these things. This festival will keep changing and keep adapting, and there's always more that you can get out of spending time with that material.
Matthew.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hi. Hello.
Hi,
Ray. Hi, Leslie. It's great to be here. Lots to think about, and it's just even in the last sentence or two that you gave us, these phrases like spending time and waiting. Of course, time is everywhere in your presentation, and for all of us, every 7 years we suddenly get much less time, and then we're in a rush, and then suddenly we're catching up. And I think this sense of time is in this work. But to get back to your main theme and your topic really about the graphic anthropology, I think it's I've been thinking while you've been showing us these images about the generosity of putting the drawings in front of us in a way that captures a different kind of time to the time that one engages in terms of these lived situations when you read a paper. And that sense of the temporality of the medium itself and the extent to which it creates an anthropology that has a different sense of its presencing and its story making with regard to the medium. And if we are looking for what graphic anthropology or drawings, it doesn't have to be anthropology, graphic archaeology in a sense, that the witnessing and the mark making creates a temporality that then makes demands upon our knowledge that can also be different, that opens up areas of investigation that call for, in a sense, new sensitivities. And for architects now, this question of new sensitivities is very big, but it's big for all of us. So that's really, it's not so much a question, but an area of interest that I'm quite inspired by in your work. And I do think that the drawings do this differently to, journal papers or.
Yeah.
That's really my observation.
It speaks to a kind of thing that's bugged me for a long time, and that's kind of the erasure of drawing in architectural academia. you know, that it's become something that one looks at and examines in a particular way, but never engages with as a practice. So it's become something which has been evacuated of the possibility of being a form of knowledge production in its own right. And that's really where, you know, my background of working with Tim Ingold comes into this, is that this is an alternative knowledge tradition, an alternative way of producing knowledge, and it enters into a really useful conversation with the written material as well. So when I'm writing, I'm then thinking about how drawings will intersect with that, what kinds of drawings I need to then do to understand more. And then when I'm drawing, I'm thinking, well, how does this respond to these bodies of theory? How does it intersect with those? And you enter into this discourse between these two, so that it becomes, you know, it becomes a dialogue. And I think that's really useful, because you're starting to see the benefits of both sides of this. But the drawings in each different type of drawing gives us a different type of understanding. And it's sometimes incumbent on the viewer to understand those and to see some of the things that are within those drawings, and also to bring things out that I might not have seen. You know, there's a potential within drawing for there to be unintended moments, for there to be things that maybe I wasn't quite aware of. You know, so there are these complexities within that, which can undermine it sometimes. You know, there's a kind of fraught nature to this, and you're still under pressure to write the journal papers and the monographs and so on. But if you can start to make those work with this idea, you know, and it's like the book on axonometric drawing, which is founded on copying the drawings. So, you know, I go to the CCA and I look at Sterling and Haydock and those people, and I get a sketchbook out and I meticulously reinscribe, you know, not to try and get into their head, but to try and understand some more of why each move is there, and just to get around the difficulty of some of the geometry, the reverse angle axonometrics that Sterling's using, the shifting conventions in Haydock's drawings, which look naive but are actually incredibly sophisticated. You know, all that stuff that comes out of, for me, engaging with drawing as a practice. So that's kind of fundamental to it. But academically, it's underpinned by the likes of Bergson, and, you know, I go back to that notion of temporality and his distinctions between creative and more technical practices.
We've got a question from Ruth, but I'm going to really rudely jump in just at this point and say there's something about all these points on time, and you mentioning Bergson, and there you've got tempo and duration in his work. There's something about colour in your drawing of objects where you can sometimes see time. So, for example, I know I always say to you, where you see the lashings on the boards, you see how fresh the lashings are and how worn the boards are. Those are beams and boards that are always used over and over again. And it's colour that's doing that allows you to see time and materials. Is there a way and there also seems to be a tension between the drawings of objects and posture and costume and that of notation. Is there something in notation, like the colour in the drawings, is there something in notation that can get at tempo and duration?
The notation does have that in it. It's less explicit in Laban notation, and I've not worked with that because I'm looking at repeated phrases almost. So you would see that as a repeated phrase again and again. There's sort of bigger notations that need to happen, where I would look at the whole process from, you know, having the announcements and the get-together to crouching down and placing it on the shoulders and hoisting it up, and then moving and turning and people coming in and out. It would become quite a vast piece of work. And it's something that I'm keen to do at some point, and that would have tempo to it. It would have sort of triggers and things like that, and it would take me back to the sumo notation example, because that's a notation of the rules of sumo, essentially. This tells us how sumo works. It's a notation of the potential of sumo. You know, so you've got the attendants and the referees, and then the two fighters here, and the notations of the various contacts that they can make here. But you have to think about certain repeated triggers. It's only this bit here that's the fight. This here is the posturing before the fight, which can go on endlessly. You know, putting down one fist but not both. And it's not until both fighters put both fists down that it triggers the actual fight. And then there's the response of the referee figure, who always remains perpendicular to the two fighters, and the conditions of victory of out of the ring or down on the floor. You know, so that notation gives me the idea that it'll be about phrases which have repetitions and potential for continuation, as well as the finite sort of parcels of stuff as well. So
I'm going to have to show you an archaeological matrix one day, but I think there's something between an archaeological matrix and notation and movement that could actually do something very new. But I realise I've been very rude, and Ruth has probably got a much better question, and I'm so sorry. Please ask your question.
No, can you hear me okay? Sorry.
Yep.
Hello. So I don't know if it's a much more interesting question, but it was a question that just occurred to me as you were talking about graphic anthropology as this like very particular method for producing new evidence. So entirely new evidence about this particular event, and it sort of creating this diverse knowledge. And this might be a bit of a contentious or unrelated question, but where do you envisage this being sort of deposited? How does it relate to archive, for example, and specifically the architectural archive as a sort of spatial performance of something in a drawing?
Well, I think, looking at that, that notion of the architectural archive and that body of things that we consider to be architecture, quite often they're described in drawing. And if we begin to think about that description of other things that we might consider as architecture, giving them an equivalence, maybe sometimes through alternative means, but sometimes literally using cross-section, plan and so on to describe these things and to say that these constitute architecture in a similar but complementary way to the Parthenon or the Barcelona Pavilion. So it enters into circulation as a potential piece of architecture once you draw it in that way. And it's not necessarily a stable method, it's a collection of multiple methods. And I think the multiplicity is important, and it introduces sort of fissures in between these things. What happens when you place the series of watercolors next to the series of marker drawings? How do you read those across one another? Is there a definite relationship between them, or what happens in that gap? And I think there are interpretations that can fit in those gaps, and there are these spaces left in it. So I think it's quite a spacious methodology in a way. It's not designed to be pinned down, but the aim is to, for me, it's to work with students in particular and to think about with them how to open them up to the social aspects of architecture in the city, and to break down the assumptions that many of our students who are increasingly middle class, wealthy from a certain background, there's a consolidation of architecture within a certain group in society again, and to ask them very straightforward questions about how do you see the world, what is actually out there, and challenging some of those suppositions that come out. So, going out with a different set of theoretical lenses, which, I teach separately, and you're looking at classic anthropological theories alongside these alternative forms of graphic representation and seeing where these can actually map onto each other. And that opens those students up to social contexts, to alterity, to all of these, other circumstances. And I think that's hugely important. And, I'm working on funding bids with colleagues at Queen's Belfast for potentially using these as part of the redesign of existing sites and developing them towards the maintenance of sites that are under risk by, reinscribing what the social importance of these sites is, and to find ways of mobilizing this, not explicitly within the architectural design process, but on some of these peripheral activities which support it in different ways. So I think there are different ways in, and I've also spoken with anthropologists about, who are keen to hear from people like architects about the specific spatial knowledge that we come with and the ways in which we think about the world through these very useful conventions. We've become very anti-convention for a long time, but something like a cross-section is hugely powerful at describing space. And when you start to sit in a room with a group of anthropologists and get them to describe that space or to describe the cross-sections of a lemon or an orange, it unlocks something about, okay, yeah, the physicality of this thing's got quite a bit more sophistication to it. And with a couple of very simple tools, you can start to illuminate that work. It benefits everyone by re-engaging with this. Sorry, that turned into a bit of a rant.
Any more questions? Oh, yeah, Albert.
Hi. Well, thanks a lot for the talk. It was very enriching. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. I hope I didn't miss something. But following what you're saying right now, I was wondering about this idea that you talked about showing the hidden that is in the city and showing the hidden during those days. And when one Googles about this festival, the first images that appear are from the Yakuza, and the tattoos of the bodies. And it feels like, I wonder if you could explain a little bit more why you decide not to draw this. And at the same time, I would like to ask you about where in your drawings can we see yourself, or in a different words, to what extent there's science in these drawings, in the axonometry, etc.
Yeah.
Where are you? Where's your subjectivity there?
Well, it's, I suppose that the contrast it lies in the difference between the axonometric and the watercolors, but both have a protocol behind them about how I arrange the drawings. So this is teachable. There would be a slightly different hand behind it, and you could certainly do this electronically, but my skills lie in hand drawing. But I've got no issue with digital drawing per se. But these are, drawn in a fairly straightforward form of axonometric. I've got a set of implicit rules about how the lines are drawn, the thickness of the pen I use for the lines, and the use of either black, grey, or brown fine liner to produce those lines. They're using pigment markers, which have got a fantastic range of colours to them. So they're chosen because they've got the subtleties of all of these different colours that allow you to describe paper and bright neon oranges and polystyrene. So there's an openness to that. But this is teachable in the same way that an architectural studio would have a house style. So to me, there's an element of the allographic about those drawings in particular. It's not purely that way, but there's an element of that in there. These are much more autographic because you're working with a brush, you're working with paint, which is unruly and doesn't do what it's told all the time. But that, to me, suited the notion of translating my understanding of this posture. And it's a bit like the way that one appreciates a dance performance, that you still feel some of that in your body. You still feel some of that in your experience of watching dancers move. But to me, this required a much more gestural, but still relatively controlled set of movements. But again, there's a protocol about how the paint is handled. There's a certain type of paper that I'm using now. The lining around the edges with a very particular blue-grey that I use all the time, so that these have a set of, they read across as a set of paintings or drawings rather than as individual all the time. So there's procedures that underpin these that are repeatable to a certain extent. So I would say I'm much more present here than in the axonometrics, but other people might argue that differently. And again, you know, I think the you're always implicit within these things. You can't, you know, I'm not presenting this as scientific, hard, objective data. You know, this is through a filter. This is through me. But the issue of the Yakuza, I think there's an ethical dimension to that about the representations of, you know, of those individuals. I don't necessarily have permission to share those in that way, and they might be identifying in a way that you couldn't necessarily identify the individuals here. And you can get around a lot by saying that it's a public event. You know, public event means that it's for public consumption and you can work with that material in a certain way. But I'm quite conscious all the time of turning this into spectacle as well. You know, you're walking a fine line all the time of this potentially being a spectacle. The Yakuza are this small fragment that enter into the sort of the Western viewpoint of this, in particular through tattoo enthusiasts in a very particular way. There's a separate project to be done about that. You know, it reminds me of Petra Kalshoven's work on American Indian reenactors in the UK and how they try and adopt this persona from elsewhere in the world. And it's similar to the way in which tattoo enthusiasts might take on that persona. You know, they might appreciate those tattoos in a very particular way, and also engage in the mythology of the Yakuza, maybe through Takeshi Kitano movies and things like that. So there's this sort of mythology around those and a reality of it that's quite distracting. And so far, it's not needed that engagement, and also they're actually incredibly hard to find. So, you know, they're present. I've seen them, but they're, you know, you kind of need to know where they are, and I've not engaged with that fully as yet. I think there's something in that, but that's not my primary concern. So, yeah, it's absent at the moment.
There's Kate's got a question, and also Alistair's put his hand up, but I think he's telling us to stop. So Kate, quickly ask it.
I think that was an old hand.
Oh, Alistair, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Kate. Go ahead.
No, it was definitely an old hand. I'm terrible at teams.
Well, I was so just for anyone who's looking, I'm on the ASSC account, Alistair. Yeah. Is there time, Leslie, to ask a question?
No, I'm glad you are asking a question. I just thought you might be telling us maybe we should wrap up. Go for it.
Okay. It was two things really. One is and well, thank you so much for a really fascinating talk, and I love seeing the images. It sparked lots of thoughts. One was about, you mentioned Kon Wajiro's drawings, and I hope I'm saying the name right because I've only come across him in passing. But I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that. And from the brief bit that you said, my understanding is that part of what those drawings were doing was documenting something fragile and temporary, but fragile in the sense of Japan in a state of transition and modernization, and also in the wake of disaster.
Yeah.
And, there's a kind of recording there of human fragility and kind of basic needs, and it makes me think about, you know, kind of what applications of the method that you're using to kind of forms of informal settlement and things like that. I guess the other question is thinking about style and the kind of precision of these drawings, and the way that there's an emphasis on kind of clarity of outline, and things are shown as discrete elements, so that there's a kind of inventory of objects and structures, and you can see how they fit together. It made me think about a term that I know Leslie has talked about in the past, which is blurriness, and whether you engage with that or think about that kind of indistinctness as well as distinctness.
Well, there's the Conway-Giro material. It makes me think of one of the first lectures that I give to my students, which is titled "Why I Draw," and it's drawn off the essay by George Orwell on why I write, and it takes these 4 categories about, you know, the notion of just through aesthetic enthusiasm, the notion of that ego that you're putting out into the world, but also about bearing witness. And it's simply saying what's there in front of you and being interested in what's there right now in front of you. So his drawings are very much 1920s Tokyo. You know, they're about, you know, that moment in time. And there's a value to that because we keep looking at his work, and we keep looking at other people's work who again simply set a task of bearing witness and saying, actually, you know, this very ordinary thing is quite interesting. And you know, that's kind of the part of the anthropological thing about this, is that it's, you know, it's ordinary. It happens in every district and every year, and the Japanese academics that I've spoken to about it have gone, oh yeah, why would you look at that? You know, that's just the festival, you know, and it's that kind of ordinary thing that doesn't always occur to you when you're in the middle of it. And I think there's kind of a joy in having somebody else look at that, and you know, I've had some really interesting reactions from Japanese architects to the work. So it's, you know, I'm careful to always return to speak to them about it and to get more information that way from a local audience about what I'm doing. But on, you know, in terms of those discrete objects and the potential blurriness, yeah, that's again, there's a limitation of time, and you could, you know, there's so many different things that I would like to do with that, of whole slices through the city, you know, accumulations of all of the things that are going on that, you know, there was a kind of a hint of that I started with the Gion Festival ones here, you know, so starting to build up these incrustations and accumulations of different things that happen just on the streetscape. But yeah, also engaging with, you know, multiple inscriptions over the top of each other of you know, bulky sheets of tracing paper, one on top of the other. All that practice of drawing, not seeing the drawing as singular but as multiple, you know, something that I talk about in the axonometric book, or a paper about tracing paper that I wrote is about the thickness of the drawing. That the drawing constitutes the whole stack of tracing paper, not just the final one that gets inked at the end. So I'm very interested in that thickness of the drawing. It's not shown here, but it's certainly something that I want to work with, is indeterminacy, and how to manipulate that, how to work with it, to look at items in isolation and then how they all come together as well. So it's like the difference between the individual elements and then, you know, bringing it together as a larger drawing like this one of the Mikoshi at Gion. It tells a different story. It does a slightly different thing. And if you worked with an image a couple of seconds later, you would have a slightly different message from that. But at this point, you've got all of those hands on the shoulder in front. There's this supportive structure of all of these people holding on to each other around this incredibly heavy structure. So it tells that particular story. There's always that editing and selectiveness within this. And I think that's one of the interesting points, is what you choose to work with. You're always making those choices, I think.
You've worked hard for your evening this evening, Ray. Lots and lots of questions. Does anyone else have a question? Can I just say, I think you'd really like Huda Tayoub's drawings.
I do indeed very much enjoy those drawings. They're astonishing. And yeah, we need to talk about the archaeological matrix that you were discussing as well. So let's pick that up. I think my dinner might be arriving now, so it might well be a good time to go.
I think probably everybody's ready for something to eat. Thank you very much. It was fantastic, and a great
Thanks so much for the invite.
A great way to start the series, and also to start up a new theme within our series on drawing. So there'll be hopefully lots more. Mark, Mark or Alistair, do you want to say anything before we go? I'm not quite sure how you thank a speaker on on clunky teams, but it was brilliant. Mark or Alistair, would you like to wrap up?
Yeah, it's great to see the technology work so well, and maybe it's because your particular material works so well in this context. But what I'd like to say is, normally we say, well, come down to the pub or the restaurant. Next time, beyond this crisis, beyond the virus, next time you're in London, it would be great to host you for a drink or a meal. And enjoy your meal tonight. But it was and very, very much appreciated.
No, thanks.
Don't forget, everyone, there's the 35% discount on the book.
Could I just add that if you'd like to join the ASSC mailing list, please drop us an email or visit our website. It's assc@bbkbookbank.ac.uk.
If anyone's got anything they'd like to follow up with, those are my contact details, and I quite regularly post any new drawings to the Instagram account there. So if you want to follow the progress of the work in that way, that's quite a visual medium to work with. Yeah, thanks so much. It's been a delight to speak to you.
Brilliant. Bye, everyone.
Bye.